Bonjour tout le monde, ça me fait plaisir de vous présenter Sarah Sadavoy, qui va donner le séminaire aujourd'hui. Elle a fait ses études de graduée à l'Université de Victoria. Ensuite, elle est allée à Québec, puis à Max Planck Institute for Astronomy. Et puis ensuite, elle est allée au Center for Astrophysics. Et finalement, bien, elle est professeure à l'Université, pas loin de chez nous, à Kingston. Et aujourd'hui, ben, elle va nous parler de finding rings in young protostellar disk, implications for planet formation and disk evolution.
Merci, Pierre, and apologies to everyone. My French is really terrible, so I'm going to now switch into English for the remainder of this talk, and hopefully I can convince you there's some cool things going on with protostellar disks and looking for structure within them. Before I get started on that, I want to begin, as I'm now doing with all of my talks, with an acknowledgement that I am at Queens, which is on the Cataraqui, the ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Huron-Wendat people. I myself am not an Indigenous person. Although I grew up not too far away from Kingston, I recognize that there's a lot that I need to do to improve my understanding of the whole aspect of land being sacred, and recognizing that my position, not only now as a professor at Queen's University, but as an observational astronomer, means that I have been very privileged to have access to lands that are very meaningful to different Indigenous populations and nations that live there and have thrived to live there for a long time. And as I mentioned, as an observational astronomer, I tend to go to telescopes that are all over the world. And so one thing I've been trying to do is learn a little bit more about the ancestral lands and the ownership of those lands. So in case you can't tell, this is Chile. This is where Alma is situated. For reference, Alma is, if I can get my mouse to show up, where is it? There it is. Alma is right about in here. All right, that's roughly where it is. And so this is the land territory map, courtesy of nativeland.ca, which is a really great resource to get a better understanding of the land ownership historically in different parts of the world, not just in Canada. So if you're interested in learning more, I highly encourage you to look to that particular resource to find out additional information. I also want to acknowledge the various people who have been part of this project and who have been my very close collaborators, both at Queen's and abroad. Specifically, there are a number of people working in the field of star and planet formation at Queen's. We call ourselves Q-Star for Queen's Star Formation Group. And it is myself and Professor Laura Fissel who are the leads in that group. And we each have various students and a postdoc who have joined us, and we're continually growing. The three names that you see highlighted in red are students who have worked with me or continue to work with me, whose work I'm going to specifically highlight here today. So I want to just give credit to the many names and the many people who have been part of this particular project. All right, so coming back to our title slide, what I'm going to be talking about is looking for pretty structures inside of protostellar disks and what that can mean, not just for the disks themselves, but for the evolution of planets and the formation of planets. And I'd be remiss if I didn't start with this particular image here. This is H.L. Tau. This is from ALMA, and ALMA just celebrated 10 years of operation this year. All right, so ALMA's been around for 10 years, and ALMA has completely revolutionized our view of disks. We went from disks being these somewhat resolved blobs to this beautiful image from 2014, so just shy of 10 years, which shows that there is structure within those disks. This was H.L. Tau, very high resolution, showing rings, showing gaps, showing multiple features going on. It was no longer just this unresolved blob, it is an entire structure. And it isn't just H.L. Tau that shows these features. Lots and lots of disks are showing gaps. They're showing rings. In some cases, you can even see spiral structures, such as in this one up here. there are cavities, holes in the disk, such as this one over here. All right, lots and lots of disks. They come in a variety of shapes. They come in a variety of structures and sizes. You get single disks, you get multiple disks. Ultimately, there is a lot of variety. So we're starting to build up a gallery, this image here coming from the D-Sharp survey, of high-resolution images of disks, and we are finding a myriad of different types of structures. Now, all of these images I'm showing you here are looking at dust. You're looking at continuum observations. So these are where dust particles are glowing themselves. But now galleries are starting to come out looking at molecular line emission and the structure of those disks in different tracers. So this is one disk. This is HD 163296, seen through a variety of different molecular line species. This is from Karen Oberg's group. And again, you can see that there is a wealth of structure. In some cases, you are seeing cavities, such as in M2D plus over here. You can even see rings, such as in HCN and C2H, which is a hydrocarbon over here. So all of these things are showing you that it isn't just dust where we are seeing the structure. The structure is seen everywhere, and it is varied from disk to disk and from tracer to tracer. And so what we want to really know is the origin of these features. All right, where are they coming from? What is producing this variance? And what are we actually tracing in the case of the molecular line emission when we go from one species to another? And so one very obvious question that people have then asked, well, are these gaps and rings caused by planets? You have a planet, it's going to perturb your disk, and it's going to open up a gap, it's going to produce a ring. Is this the origin of all of these structures? And there have been a number of people who've simulated such things, such as Ruben Dong right here from 2018, where if you input a planet, in this case, this is a super Earth planet, shown by the green dot, into a disk, and you let that disk evolve over many, many orbits, you can open up gaps and rings within the dust, which is shown on the right side here, that are long-lasting structures. And this is just by virtue of putting a planet in and allowing it to have gravitational perturbations, resonances, and so forth that end up shaping the structure of that particular disk. There's also some recent work that has demonstrated correlations between the locations of gaps and rings and the known orbits of Kepler planets. So this is additional correlations that suggest that there could be a planetary origin for these disk features. So over here, you've got images that show the examples of some gaps and rings, and then you've got some examples of Kepler orbits. And if you do statistical correlations between them, you tend to see a little bit of similarity between where the gaps are located and where the planets are located. More important is actually starting to detect protoplanets, and this is something that's really only happened in the last little bit, but we are starting to see protoplanets, so planets that are in the process of accreting material from their surrounding disks, such as in PDS 70 over on the left, where you can see one of the young planets is very much at the edge of a cavity. And then you've got AB Aurigae, which again has a planet on the edge of a cavity that is accreting material from the surrounding disk material. And it's important to note that these are the first detections of protoplanets, and there are in disks that have these very large cavity structures, so central holes around the young star itself. But the problem is we've actually never detected a protoplanet inside of a gap or associated with a ring. All right, and that would really be the ideal piece of direct evidence that demonstrates that they are the cause for forming the gaps and rings that we see in disks. And we haven't just seen that yet. Now, that doesn't mean that those planets are not there. It could just be an observational bias, specifically due to the fact that it's really hard to detect protoplanets unless they're actively creating a lot of material. And so this is something that the NGVLA in the future could enable us to do. This is a simulation that shows what a low mass planet in a gap of HO tau would look like with the NGVLA at 25 gigahertz, which is about 1 centimeter or so. And so the idea here is that with that many more dishes with the NGVLA, you can detect these protoplanets at very high resolution in the future. This is not something we could do right now, but hopefully in the future, we would be able to see these sorts of things in action. So protoplanets, not something we can directly identify as being associated with gaps and rings, but certainly there's a fair bit of indirect evidence. But the other question is, well, okay, if they form these gaps and rings and the planets had to form earlier, where did the planets form? And one of the challenges is that rings are actually a natural place where we would expect planet formation to take place. And so this has to do with the fact that you need to make your dust grains grow in size to build a planet. So you have yourself a circumstellar disk of dust and gas around your young star, and those dust grains start off small, a few microns in size. And you need them, grow them to pebbles, to boulders, to planetesimals before they actually become a fully formed planet. And so that typically happens in the coldest, densest regions of disks, which is in the midplane, as you can see by the dark brown region here, where we expect dust grains, due to the high densities, to collide together. And at cold temperatures, they've got ice mantles, and that lets them stick together when they collide so that they become these larger, fluffier aggregates. A really good analogy for this is this object from the Kuiper Belt that New Horizons took a picture of, 5-ish years ago at this point. Originally called Ultima Thule, now called Arrokoth. All right, icy body 1, icy body 2, at some point in time, collided, stuck together, and now circling the sun is one bigger thing. That is exactly what we expect to happen, of course, on much smaller size scales in disks to make larger and larger bodies. And so what we have been able to do now, again, with ALMA and with the VLA, with multi-wavelength data, is get high-resolution observations of some nearby disks where we can see that they have this structure, and we can start to map what the dust grains are doing in these regions. So what you have here is a plot where on the top, on the top here, you've got the surface density of dust in the pink, and you'll see that the dust has the surface density that wiggles. It goes up and down, up and down, up and down. And where you have a deficit of surface density, that's where you have a dark band. That's where the D stands for, or the D13, or a gap. And where you have a peak in your surface density, that's where you have a bright ring. All right, otherwise known as a B on this graph. And so we are seeing this trend of up and down due to the fact that this disk has both gaps and rings, and it's constantly changing as a function of radius. You can do radius transfer modeling to try to combine all of those multi-wavelength data to infer what the grain sizes are as a function of radius as well. And that's what this lower graph here is showing you. It's showing you the maximum grain size as a function of radius through radius transfer modeling. And again, you can see it wiggles. It goes up and down, up and down, up and down. The grain size is not constant throughout this disk. And in some cases, you can see a nice, a nice correlation between a dark band and a lower grain size. And there's some indication that there is a correlation between many of these, but there's no clear correlation between a bright band and larger dust grains. They seem to be slightly offset from each other. But that said, there is a variance in the grain sizes that we are seeing. And so if you are going to form a planet, you need to first form larger pebbles and boulders. And so you need grain growth to be fast and efficient. And so if we're going to see future planets in H.R. Tau, if they haven't formed already, they're going to be in the sites where the grains are the largest. So there's going to be some sort of disconnect potentially between the structure we see now and the formation of planets, or if planets are embedded within H.R. Tau, we just can't see them, there's this then preponderance of will there be future planets that then come out of this disk down the line. So coming back to the D-sharp disks, again, this beautiful gallery, lots of pretty images, lots of information that we can glean. We do not know still what the origin of these gaps and rings are. This is still an open question. If they are formed by planets, and the planets themselves formed much earlier in the disk's evolution, But if these are indications of where planets are in the process of forming because they are correlated with the grain growth, then another mechanism is necessary to produce this variance of structure. And what we need to do is we need to then determine which of these cases are involved. So this is kind of like a chicken or an egg problem. Which came first? Do you get rings first or planets first, or are they forming together? And ultimately, we can't answer that question looking at these disks. These are beautiful disks. There's lots of information in them, but these are all protoplanetary disks. These are all disks around pre-main sequence stars. So they're several million years old. So there's been a lot of time for the disks to have evolved themselves as a function of where they were when they first showed up. And so a good way of viewing that is by this plot here by Charles Law, which shows the disk fraction above a dust mass of 10 Earth masses as a function of cluster age for different clusters. And so this is looking, again, at clusters that are primarily a few million years old, so clusters that are dominated by pre-main sequence stars. And what you can see is there is a dramatic drop in disk mass as a function of cluster age. And so what ends up happening is we are looking at evolution of the disk in process, right? Disks change dramatically as a function of the age of the star that they are surrounded by, or they're surrounding. And so what we need to do is we need to not look at disks that have already had time to evolve. We need to look at disks that are younger, the ones that formed initially, that are still setting the initial conditions for the planet formation process. And these are what I'm going to term protostellar disks. So to put this in a little bit of context, star formation is an evolutionary sequence. There is a time scale for it. It is relatively short compared to most time scales people in astronomy look at, but it still is a time scale. So at the far end here, you've got the oldest, the end products of the star formation sequence. These are the final stages. These are the pre-main sequence stars. And as astronomers, we like to put things in sub-bins. And so we have different classifications for the different stages of protostar formation. And so we call these class 2 and class 3, where the distinction is, do you have a really substantial disk, or do you have more of a diffuse debris disk? So that's the difference between class 2 and class 3. But the earlier stages are what we call the protostellar stage. These are when the young star itself is still inside its native cocoon, all right? The envelope and core of material that it formed out of, and it's accreting material from that environment. And that accretion is not going to happen to the star directly. What's going to happen is through conservation of angular momentum, that material is going to fall into the disk. And so the disk is going to grow. It's going to be fed by this accretion process. That's going to change the nature of the disk. And that disk is also going to feed the star. And that, again, is going to evolve the nature of the disk. And as astronomers, again, we like to put things in multiple bins. And so we've got subclasses for these, class 0, class 1, where the main distinction between them is the rate of accretion and the relative fraction of mass that's in the star versus in the envelope, in the core. So the class 0 stage, you're the most deeply embedded. And in the class 1 stage, you're still embedded, but you have a little bit less surrounding material and your accretion processes aren't as rapid. So this is the distinction that we need to look at. And so what we really need to look at are the first 2 stages, the class 0, class 1, the stages which are in the first 500,000 year of the formation of the protostar. So the youngest stages where we have ever been able to detect disks around young stars. And it's important to note that we are starting to detect structure in disks around young stars. The first confirmed detection being IR63, which is a class 1 disk in the nearby Ophiuchus cloud. Class 1, this is again yet less than 500,000 year old. And this was done by Dominic Secura-Cox. And this image shows you the ring structure, but this is the ring structure in a residual image. So it's really hard to see these features in young disks because the young disks are super dense. They are very optically thick. And so what they did here is they basically removed a smooth disk profile in order to let the structure that is beyond the smooth disk profile stand out a little bit more. So that's what you have here on the left. And on the right, you have a radial profile of the intensity, but you're seeing that from the residual image. So again, that smooth disk profile has been taken out. So it's a little hard to kind of see those ring features in the contrast image on the left, but you can see that they stand out more in the residual profiles on the right. So these were the first indications that structures actually can be detected in protostellar disks. And we do not have many more than this already detected. So we need to start building larger and larger samples, but this is something that's still only a few years old, and we're going to get there in the future. But the first thing we need to figure out is how common is structure in disks? What are the properties of these features? All right, are they similar or are they different from what we see in the protoplanetary phase? And then how do these things form? We do not expect these structures to form via planets because it generally, based on theory, takes more than 500,000 years to build a planet. So we know that there's going to have to be other mechanisms that need to be explored. And so to better understand the formation of structure, what I have been doing is working with students to look at structure in protostellar disks, taking data from a completely different project that had a completely different set of goals. This is a polarization study I did of all the protostellar disks in Ophiuchus. So the original goal of this proposal was to look at magnetic fields and how magnetic fields affect the properties of disks. And that is still a goal that a research interest that I have. But it's important to note that polarization data are so much more than just the polarization signals themselves, because polarization requires long integration times. You're looking for a few percent signal on your source, so you have to spend a lot of time on it. So to put that in context, in most cases, if you're looking at a disk around a young star, unless you're doing a deep dive into it, if you're doing a large survey, you might spend 10 to 30 seconds with ALMA on your disk, because ALMA, having so many dishes, as you can see down here, is really good at collecting light, even at 10 to 30 seconds. For these polarization targets, each disk was observed for about 7.5 minutes. So by virtue of time spent on source, I have exceedingly sensitive data, and that exceedingly sensitive data is important for polarization, but I also get to study the disk structure. And I'm able to pull out information from the disk structure without needing to use the polarization as well. So the important thing that we have here is we get multiple layers of information that can be used from multiple avenues of science. So what I'm going to focus on today is the continuum data that came from the ALMA observations and the fact that they're just so high sensitivity. So in case you're not familiar with interferometry, a little bit of a breather on how it operates. Unlike a single dish telescope, you have an array of, let's say, 40, 45 dishes that are working in tandem to basically try to simulate a giant telescope. So that's the whole point of an interferometer. All of your dishes, they're looking at the same target. You are cross-correlating signals from pairs of antenna to get an interference pattern, and you're going to build up that interference pattern in order to simulate what a giant telescope the size of your array would have seen. It's an incomplete giant telescope, but it is still a giant telescope. And so we tend to look at things not in terms of brightness as a function of sky position, but brightness as a function of UV distance, where UV distance is the projection of each of those antenna pairs on the sky. And so that's what you have on the image here. On the right is just an example of sampling of the UV visibilities for a particular data set. And the idea is each telescope pair has a particular UV distance, and because you are integrating for a time t, the Earth is rotating, and so you end up with these little tracks. If you had a perfect interferometer, you would fill in that entire UV plane completely. But because it's not perfect, you've got these gaps in it, you are missing some spatial scales. So the important thing to note is short UV distances, so things that are in the middle here are sensitive to large spatial scales, and things at the outer edges are sensitive to small scale features. So we're missing information. And so the whole point of cleaning an image with interferometry data is to try to fill in those missing gaps and to see what you can still glean based on the information that you have. So ideally, what you do is you take all of your telescope pairs, you have your UV distances for each telescope pair as a function of each pair, as a function of time, as a function of your frequency band, and you can stack them all, and you can basically map out your signal as a function of your angular scale. Again, short UV distances, that's telling you where power is on large scales, and small and large UV distances are telling you where your signal is on small scales. And so this is information that we can use. And if I told you that this was a disk, you'd be like, well, okay, maybe, all right. If I told you there was structure in this disk, you'd be like, I don't know. How do you see that? This is not as intuitive, all right? Most people like to think in the image plane, something like this. I can show you a pretty picture of a disk and you'd be like, oh yes, I know how big that is. I know how to translate that into a size. I know how to translate that into a total flux. That is easy to do. This is a reconstructed image from these UV visibilities, but there's a catch. While an image plane is intuitive and easier to interpret, you have to smooth with your point spread function, with your distribution of all of your visibilities. You're basically smoothing with a beam. And you can play tricks to try to adjust your beam in order to get the highest resolution that you can possibly image, but you're always smoothing, which means you're always losing information if you're interested in small scale features. If you want to look for small scale features like rings or gaps, smoothing is a bad idea. And so what you really want to do is, instead of making models based on your image plane, you kind of want to make a model, like I drew freehand this orange line, in your visibility space, because this is still your data. You can still do things with this. It's not as intuitive, but you can still glean information out of it. And this is some work that some wonderful students who have worked with me have really utilized and explored to really benefit and better understand the properties of disks. So I want to run through just the power of UV visibilities and how you can really utilize them to detect structure that you otherwise would not see in the image plane. So this is work that was done by Hannah, looking at WL17, which is sort of a transitionary disk. And this is the same disk in two different sets of observations. On the left, you have my 1.3 millimeter data from the polarization study, which has high sensitivity, but somewhat coarse resolution in the image plane. And on the right, you have the same disk at 3 millimeters from work that Patrick Sheehan produced, but at much higher resolution, about a factor of 6 better in resolution. And if I told you that those were the same disks, you may not believe me, because the 3 millimeter disk clearly shows that it is a ring, or at the very least has a very strong cavity in the middle, whereas the 1.3 millimeter data, if you just looked at it, you'd say it's a Gaussian. And you would say that there was no evidence of there being a cavity. And that's because we've lost information in the UV, in transferring from the UV visibilities to the image plane, because we've smoothed by our beam. And you can see the difference in the beam sizes by the white circles in each of the panels. If I were to show you the UV visibilities for both those disks, they look very similar, in spite of the fact that the disks are very different in the image plane. Now, I don't expect you to look at this visibility and intuit that there is a cavity there, but you'll note that both of the profiles show signals that dip below 0 at about 1,000 kilolambda UV distance. And that is very important, because that dip below 0 is the signature of the cavity. So the cavity, which we directly see from the 3 millimeter data, you could actually fit and get a size for in the image plane. You could not do that in the image plane in the 1.3 millimeter data. However, we can model a disk with a cavity in the visibilities, and that's what the red curve is showing, and we can recover the exact same cavity that we were not able to see in the image plane as what you can see in the image plane in the 3 millimeter data. So what this shows is just the power of going to the UV visibilities to see these structures. And because we have such high sensitivity in this polarization data, we're able to pull out these features and model them really well, because we have such high signal to noise. even though we don't have a lot of sampling at high UV distances, we still have signal there because we had such long integrations. Now, a quick caveat is, what we're looking for is basically wiggles in the UV visibility. So that's indication that the disk is not smooth, that there's something there. You dip below zero, you've got yourself potentially a gap or a cavity. If you show some wiggling in your UV visibilities, that's indication that you probably have some sort of ring-like structure or spiral-like structure. So that's what we're looking for. But it's important to know that not all cases are going to show this, that there are other factors that need to be taken into account. So this is an example from our nose work from just last year, looking at VLA 1623 West. You got an image of it here on the left, and it looks pretty smooth, but again, we don't have the greatest resolution in the image plane. And then we've got the visibilities on the right. And again, I don't expect you to intuit exactly what this disk looks like based on UV visibilities. It is not as intuitive as the image plane itself, but you'll notice that it goes below zero. So you might be thinking, hey, I just showed you this for WL17. It's the same thing. It goes below zero. There must be a cavity. And you can fit these UV visibilities for this particular source with a gap and a ring, and you can get a really good fit to the data. However, that's not the only interpretation you can make with this particular set of observations. This disk is very edge-on. It's got an inclination of about 80 degrees. It's also a very young source, so the disk is highly optically thick. So if you look at its intensity profile, it's very, very flat, and then it kind of just drops off at the edges. And that's because it's edge-on, very optically thick. So you can describe its profile with something called like a flat top Gaussian. So it's not a regular Gaussian, it's kind of a Gaussian that has a much sharper fall off. And a visibility profile is essentially a Fourier transformation of my model. And if I have a model with a sharp edge, I'm going to get ringing. And that is exactly what this red curve model is showing you here, is a fit to the visibility data for just a smooth flat top disk. And the ring and the features that you're seeing there is just ringing from the Fourier transformation of a sharp edge. And so what ends up happening is you have two different interpretations for this disk. And using statistical arguments, this model is actually favored over a gap and a ring. So you have to be very careful. Wiggles are indicative of something, but you have to be careful that you don't overinterpret your structure, because it's not quite the same thing as absolutely knowing everything. So you've got to be a little bit careful. The UV visibilities are powerful, but they're not the only way to uniquely identify your sources. All right, so I promised I was going to talk about structure and protostellar disks, so let's open up our sample to not just one or two disks. Let's look at a sample of several disks from this Ophiuchus study. So Arnaud, as part of his master's thesis, looked at the 10 brightest disks in the Ophiuchus sample. We want to make sure we get high enough signal to noise to get a good model, and ones that were isolated. So it didn't have a nearby companion because those can confuse the visibilities, and we want to make things as simple as possible. So these were the 10 disks that we selected. And this is the outcome of doing all of the modeling. All right, what we have here are 4 of them show very clear evidence that they are likely structured. 4 of them were ambiguous. So VLA 1623 West, it's cut off by the little video over there, but it was identified as ambiguous because we can't infinitively rule out that it doesn't have substructure. All right, statistically not favored, but that doesn't mean it isn't a good fit. So 4 of them were ambiguous, and then 2 of them were identified as being completely not structured at the sensitivity that we are able to observe things. So this was the outcome of this particular sample. So let's look at some of the cases. So this is an example of what a smooth disk looks like. All right, this is Iris 37A, a little snapshot of what the disk itself looks like in the corner, and then the visibility profile. And takeaway is it's smooth. There's no wiggles in it. Doesn't really dip below zero. All right, you can fit it with a Gaussian. You can fit it with a power law quartile model, which is a description of a disk as an exponential intensity profile with a power law extension, because these are young disks. they have envelopes, and so the power law extension is to represent the envelope. So that's another common model that is used for disks, but basically it's smooth. It matches those. So we don't need to inject any other features to explain this. Here's R63, which is the most structured disk in the sample of 10 that we looked at. All right, and again, you can see that it doesn't follow a nice smooth profile. So the black line here shows you what a completely smooth disk would be. It deviates from that quite substantially. And then we build up the model with 1 ring, 2 rings, and then 2 rings plus an inner Gaussian in order to come up with the best fit to the UV visibilities. Image is shown in the little cutout there. Again, none of those features are directly observable in the image plane. You can only tell that those features exist because of the visibility profile. This is also the same source that I showed you earlier as being the first protostellar disk to show ring structures. This was by Dominic Segura-Cox, who had much higher resolution, about a factor of 5 better resolution, in order to, in the image plane, see those ring structures. And even though we have coarser data, the visibility fitting gives us the exact same ring location and very comparable ring widths, even though those are both at much higher resolution than what we could possibly recover in the image plane. So the high sensitivity and the UV modeling enables us to recover what higher resolution data are able to visually see. So while we don't intuitively see these features, we can certainly model them. So this is the sample of all 4 of the structured disks. So you got IR63 in the top left corner, which we've already talked about. And then you've got OFM6, GSS30, IRIS3, and OFM9. And again, big takeaway is that all 4 of them show UV visibilities that completely deviate from a smooth disk model, and that means something else has to be present. And how we infer the structure is we just use a Gaussian, and we are able to better match the observations if we include a Gaussian ring, or in the case of IR63, 2 rings and an inner disk. So this is where we stand. We now have 4 disks in one cloud out of a sample of 10 that are showing this kind of structure. So because this is all within one cloud, we can start to compare the structured disks to the non-structured disks or the ambiguous disks to see if there's any sort of variance between them. And so this is a plot that shows the different disks, all 10 of them that we looked at, and their total flux. All right, so this is the total disk flux that we get from doing the modeling. And you've got the smooth disks shown in black, the ambiguous disks shown in blue, and the structured disks in red. And so what we find is that the structured disks tend to be the brightest ones. And if we assume that brightness is comparable to mass, so that brighter disks have more mass, which is, a good first order estimate, then we can naively first order envelopes say that the most massive of the protostellar disks are the ones that are going to generally show structure. And this is a really good agreement with what protoplanetary disks have seen. So this is a plot that compares protoplanetary disks, and it shows the ones that have identified structure, which is either rings or transition disks, or ones that have cavities. And then you've got the black points, which are non-structured disks. And what this plot shows is that generally higher mass disks show structure in the protoplanetary phase 2. So what this could mean is that we have a correlation in the sense that perhaps the higher mass protoplanetary disks that have structure evolved from high mass protostellar disks that also had structure, that there's some sort of evolutionary pathway between them. But there's one big caveat to that, and that is the structure that we're seeing for the protostellar disks is very different than the structure that has been reported for protoplanetary disks. Specifically, we're only seeing rings, we see no gaps, and the rings are very broad. So this is in comparison to protoplanetary disks, which again, on the side here, generally have narrow rings, all right? And they also tend to show gaps. It isn't just a ring on top of a disk, you are seeing these very strong gaps as well. So this plot here shows the width of the ring scaled by the size of the disks, because all of these disks are at different distances, just to kind of give you a sense of how big each ring is relative to its host disk. For the 4 disks that are now studied in Ophiuchus, and then in the blue points, you have examples from the D-sharp survey, for which we have these measurements available. And so typically what we're seeing are very broad rings in the protostellar sample, whereas in comparison, the protoplanetary rings tend to be much, much, much narrower. And so this indicates that there is a very strong distinction between the properties of these features and what is seen elsewhere. The other important note is that the rings themselves are very shallow in the protostellar disks. What I mean by that is they have low contrast. So I made a couple of cartoons just to kind of indicate what I mean by that. So low contrast or a shallow ring means that the relative enhancement from the ring is small compared to the underlying intensity profile from the disk. So that's what this little blip here is meant to represent. Whereas if you have high contrast, that means that the intensity coming from the ring is strong relative to its underlying profile. So that's what we mean, the difference between low and high contrast. And if we were to plot this for, again, the D-sharp disks that we have this information for, and compare them to our protostellar disks, for the most part, we are seeing these shallow enhancements, low contrast for our protostellar disks, whereas the protoplanetary disks have a broad range. All right, they look like a random distribution. So statistically, we would not expect to have all of our data points at the lower end. Granted, we do have small number statistics. So ultimately, what we need to do is build our statistics well beyond this particular case. But ultimately, what we're seeing is that our disks are showing these broad, shallow enhancements, which make them distinct from the protoplanetary disks. All right, they are not the same features. They might occur in the same disks or the same kind of disks, the high mass disks, the brightest disks, but they are not the same features. And so this lends the question, what are these rings going to do? Are these rings the precursors for planets? So are planets going to form in these ring enhanced features? Or are these rings going to evolve into the protoplanetary rings that we see later on? Those are the 2 avenues that I could see them kind of branching off into. If they form into planets, the planets then carve the rings that we see later on. But if they evolve into the rings that we see later on, then planets may not need to be involved in this. And I will argue that I have absolutely no idea which one is correct, partially because we have so much we still need to know about these ring features. All right, we're only really building information about them right now. But I think it's an interesting question. It's a question that hopefully we are going to get more understanding of. One of the problems is we don't actually know what these enhancements are. This is all enhancements in flux, which means it could be a density enhancement, it could be a temperature enhancement, it could be a change in the dust grain properties, such as the opacity of the dust grains, or the size of the dust grains, or the shape of the dust grains. Any of those things could affect the millimeter flux that we see in a localized region. So ultimately, what we need to do is we need to better understand the properties of those features, and that requires doing radiative transfer modeling to get some of the physics out. Right now, we've had no physics. We need to inject some physics. And that's something that a current master student working with me, Seamus Tobin, is working on, is trying to apply radiative transfer codes within the UV visibility modeling to better understand the physics behind these disks. So the plot down here is not for one of our sources. This is for a different protostellar source, HOPS 383, but it shows the power of the radiative transfer modeling in the visibilities. You can see how they're able to model both the disk and the envelope, and also model the SED of the protostar as well, pulling in all of the information that they can glean into the code and trying to do all of this modeling together. So this is one piece of information that we need. Another piece of information is figuring out where these enhancements come from, and that requires talking to people who do simulations and theoretical modeling of disks. And this is a big challenge because most modeling is can go in various different directions. So there's been a lot of interest in understanding where ring features can come from in disks. So there's different ways that it can happen. You know, I've given some examples of different simulations here. So what you have are ring and gap features, some of which are simulated observations and some of which are just the model itself. But the important takeaway is what you need to essentially do is you need to either create some sort of giant instability that causes your disk to become gravitationally unstable, such as in, oh, where's my mouse? Here it is. Gravitationally unstable, and so you get often these spiral structures with gravitational instabilities, or you need to build up some sort of pressure gradient, you know, create a pressure trap that stops the radial drift of dust grains, causes them to kind of collect at a particular point. That creates a ring, and then you're able to open up a gap on the other side. And that's what ends up happening over here. So this one here, this is showing a simulation with zonal flows where you have magnetic fields that are the source of that, like magnetic stresses are the source of that pressure trap. And over here, this is where you have dead zones, where you've got turbulence in your disk, and that is, and different turbulent layers are the source of your pressure trap. But you can also do it chemically, for example, with snow lines, where different chemical species freeze out at different points. So these are examples of simulations that have been done relatively recently. And one thing I will note is that most of these simulations are designed for protoplanetary disks, so they are not designed for protostellar disks. And none of them have, to my knowledge, ever predicted broad, shallow enhancements with zero gaps. You always end up with both rings and gaps, and generally the rings are very narrow and very well defined and sharp, and they're not these shallow enhancements. So we have no idea how these features that we're seeing in the Ophiuchus disk could be generated based on typical simulations, but it's possible that the physics that's being covered are not applicable to protostellar disks. There is one recent simulation that does seem more in line with protostellar disks, which is looking at what happens to your disk when you have infalling material coming from an envelope. So in this particular case, you have an infall radius, which is what's shown by this inner dotted circle here. You've got gas falling in there, and you get Rossby wave instabilities forming as a result of that. And those waves can propagate outward as a function of time as the infall, even after the infall ends, but as the infall is still happening. So that's what this simulation here is showing, is an example of this Rossby wave instability starting and then over a function of time moving outward further out in the disk. So this is very interesting, and this is very much more what we would expect protostellar disks to have. That said, if you look at their simulation after 14,000 years of once infall has ended, again, you're seeing gaps, you're seeing rings, you're not seeing shallow, broad enhancements. So I think a lot more work still needs to be done. So ultimately, I'm going to stand by the statement of, I don't know where these ring enhancements are coming from. I don't know what's causing them in terms of the physics that is making them look like flux enhancements. And I also don't know how they would have formed or how they're going to evolve. But this is something that I'm still very much interested in exploring and also building up larger and larger samples of them. But I do recognize I am very much running out of time. So I want to end not with conclusions, but with takeaway messages. The things that if you leave this room with anything, I hope you leave it with this. First, ALMA has given us this turning point in disks. You probably have heard about someone make that statement before, and I just am going to reiterate it. Very much, we are able to probe parameter spaces we've never been able to probe before. In the case of protostellar disks, we are seeing some similarities with the protoplanetary disks. The brighter ones, the ones that are likely the higher mass, they're the ones that show structure. But we are also seeing some differences. The structure that comes out of these disks is not the same. We're seeing these broad, shallow enhancements, which is completely indistinct from what you see at the protoplanetary stage. And we see no evidence of strong gaps, which again, you typically see at the protoplanetary stage. So a lot more work needs to be done to, first of all, figure out what these enhancements are being caused by. Is it temperature? Is it density? Is it the dust grain properties? Is it something else? And also, what could possibly form them? And I would argue that the origin of these ring structures is a really important and interesting open question, because they could be the precursors for planets, or they could be the precursors for protoplanetary rings. And either one of those evolutionary pathways would be super, super interesting. And I'm hoping that as we build up larger and larger samples of these particular structures in more and more young disks, we are going to open up avenues of both theoretical and observational studies that will hopefully help us figure out which one of these pathways is either dominant or the ultimate pathway that ends up happening. But with that, I'm done, and I'd be very happy to take questions.
So the images you've shown us are face on, right? Is there anything to be learned by looking at them side edge on?
Yeah, so I guess a lot of the sample disks I showed you are face on. So let me go back. I think you're talking about, for example, this source, which is kind of, it's actually more of a 45-degree-ish angle. So it's, mostly face on. So in this case, it is much easier to confirm structure in a disk that isn't highly inclined. It's a lot harder to pull that out. That said, not all of the disks actually are face on. So OF M6 here is actually fairly inclined. I think its inclination was 70 degrees, if I remember correctly. It's not as high as VLA 1623 West, but it is still very much highly inclined. GSS 30 IRS3 actually is closer to 80 degrees inclination, so it's even more inclined than OF M6. OF M9 is very face on. So not all of them are face on. So just to kind of give you an example. So here's OF M6 and GSS 30 IRS3 is up here. So you can see that those are fairly inclined in comparison. So, but when you're doing the modeling, you're modeling a face-on disk, and then you are also inclining the model before you're doing the fitting within the visibility space. So you are taking the inclination of the source into account within the modeling itself. So the visibility information has to be projected based on your position angle of your source as well as the inclination. So that is folded in. Does that answer your question?
Yes, partially. Is there any information? Can you measure the thickness of the disk?
Yes, you can. And I actually cut these slides out for time, but thank you for asking that. Let me see if I can find them. Oh no, I wanted to, there's so much I could say. You don't even need to know how many slides I took out. VLA 1623 West, we actually believe is geometrically thick. We think it is flared. And the reason why we think that is when we remove our model and we're only assuming a thin disk model, we get residuals that look like this. And so we get these residuals that are at the four corners, exactly where you would expect the flaring to be. So this is very consistent with a flared disk. And unfortunately, the tools that we are using to model the disk do not enable us to include three-dimensional disk shapes easily. So we have to model them as 2D structures. But down the line, I am hoping to do this to better understand this disk because we see these residuals both at 870 microns and 1.3 millimeters, and they're more substantial at 870, exactly as you would expect if you had temperature stratification as well. So I think this is very much a case of, yes, there is going to be geometric thickness, and GSS 30 IRS3, which is also highly inclined, shows very similar residuals as well. So we think that one is probably also geometrically thick. But for the most part, we have to first order assume everything is just a thin pancake because that's the way that the code is set up.
Go ahead.
Thanks. You didn't say anything about the eventual star that wasn't formed. About mass. The models they take into account divider here. What's the difference between the models?
Yeah, so for the initial look of the structure, we're just looking at flux distribution. So we actually aren't worrying about the star at all. For the radio transfer modeling, we do need to take into account the potential star properties. And for us, it's actually the accretion luminosity that matters more than the internal luminosity of the star itself. Because these are protostars, you don't see the star directly, and we cannot infer a star mass unless you can measure Keplerian rotation in the disk. And as far as I know, I believe only IRS-63 sort of has a measurement of dynamical mass, but I don't think it's a very robust measurement. So we don't really have a strong indication. That said, all the disks we've been looking at are in Ophiuchus, and they're all going to be low mass stars. So we don't really expect any of these stars to have, to be an OB analog. Like they're all going to be generally solar mass of order solar mass.
What about the modeling? They take into account, like you have binary form?
Oh, yes. So for them, we did try to select objects where we're sure there's no wide binary companion. We can't rule out a tight binary companion, and unfortunately, that is not something that we'll be able to do unless we probably go to radio wavelengths and do high resolution radio studies, because everything becomes so optically thick in the millimeter that you're not going to be able to detect individual star signatures easily that way. And you can't see anything in the infrared because it's embedded within a core of stuff. So to first order, we have to assume it's a single star because we have no evidence otherwise. That said, I imagine if you can get very good molecular line emission to trace the velocity structure, you might be able to infer if there's deviations from Keplerian rotation that could indicate a perturbation from a companion that may be somewhere in the disk. But as far as I know, we are hoping that there are no tight binaries in the system when we go to the radio transfer modeling. But for the modeling that I've shown you thus far, it's just the flux distribution, so there's no physics. The radio transfer, we have to assume some sort of star mass, and we're going to fix it to something because we have no way of estimating it, unfortunately. Not without a lot of new data.
I was going to ask about Keplerian, but what you said is interesting. You don't see the star itself, even like
Correct.
the infrared, so you could just, I was thinking of Spirou or other instruments where you could
look
for spectroscopic binaries or things.
No, you get scattered. If anything, you'll get scattered light from the envelope itself. Now, it's ironic you asked about Keplerian rotation. I've got West up here because we actually, very recently, a paper was published that did measure Keplerian rotation for it in C18O. And they get a star mass, I believe, of about 0.44, 4.5 solar masses for this particular object. And I have C17O data of this source, and I get also Keplerian rotation for it, and we get a slightly higher but still consistent star mass.
Masses of very young objects, that's a challenge.
It's such a challenge, yeah.
For stellar models, so having Keplerian disk would be great.
It's it's wonderful if you can get it. The problem is you need a good tracer of it, and when you have an embedded source inside an envelope, C18O gets confused with emission from the envelope, so you need a different tracer. And other tracers like CS and C17O can be complicated due to other chemistry or hyperfine structure. So there are things that people can do. It is just challenging because you have to deal with optical depth in terms of your line. 12CO is useless for this. You have to deal with contamination from your envelope, specifically of an infalling envelope. And it's really hard to identify a good molecular line tracer that is found in the disk, not found in the envelope, and is going to trace primarily the midplane of the disk and not the upper layers. So it's something that people are trying to do, and it is possible. It's a little bit more complicated than protoplanetary disks, just because there's a lot more things that can confuse your signal. And unfortunately, yes, you cannot see the star directly at all. So we cannot get a spectral type or any information from the star itself, which is a shame, because that would make some things easier.
We have a question from online.
Oh, yes.
TJ Lee. Hi, Sarah. Thanks for the exciting results. I'm intrigued by the broad and shallow rings in protostellar disks. I would naively expect such disks to be more turbulent and also smaller grain size compared to more evolved disks. both of which would run any perturbation. For example, do you know if the simulation you highlighted assumed a certain turbulent viscosity alpha, and that we contribute to why they can explain the broad and shallow rings you're finding in your observations?
That is a really good question. I don't remember them quoting any turbulent assumptions. I was not on that study. This is just one of several different simulations that they show. This is actually their fiducial one. They also have ones where, they assume like, streamline infall or sheet-like infall. I just chose these two because they were the first ones on the list of simulations that they showed. But I don't remember the paper mentioning anything about turbulence. So to the person who's online, I do apologize that I don't have a clear answer to that question. But yes, in terms of grain sizes, that is something else that I'm very much interested in, just also in terms of the grain growth to planets. And understanding the rate of grain growth, specifically at protostellar stages, is super important for that. And that's something else that the polarization data could be very helpful for, but from the scattering angle, to help constrain maximum grain sizes within the disks. But yeah, we don't have good constraints on a lot of things, unfortunately, which makes the modeling a lot harder. Absolutely.